This is a special purposeful AirMiners event on what can be a really complicated topic. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. My name is Jason Grillo. I'm the event director for AirMiners. And when Tito and I were thinking of this event, something about environmental justice that we felt really passionate about. We felt that AirMiners cannot exist in a vacuum. We don't want to have carbon dioxide removal be in a silo. So we wanted to have an event where we discuss issues of environmental justice, and we felt like we owed it to our community and to others in society who would be impacted by carbon dioxide removal, so that we can develop and advance the industry and advance the ideas of environmental justice. So I'll say that it's times a complicated, difficult subject to address, in that the climate movement, the environmental movement, tends to trend very white, very male. My own journey in bringing this meeting together was to work with a variety of excellent panelists and people on getting this together. Heidi, who you'll meet in a minute, Tito as the founding member of AirMiners. In working with a diverse group of people, it caused me to reevaluate some of my own assumptions about privilege, about my own position as a white, male, cis, hetero person in how we approach issues of equity going forward. So that in mind, we have a stellar lineup of presenters today. I'll walk through the agenda of how we're going to proceed. Tito, if you could move to the next slide. So we're going to start off with some introductions of Heidi and the panelists. Then we'll have about a 35-minute panel discussion followed by some Q&A. We'll have a slight break and then go into breakout sessions of maybe 5 or 6 people each, and then conclude with 5 or 10 minutes of recap and thinking through presenting some of the ideas that we came up with about how to further environmental justice. So we've got a whole slew of topics to get to today. And without further ado, I want to introduce Heidi Lim, who will serve as our moderator. Heidi is one of the earliest members of our AirMiners community, in addition to currently serving as Chief of Staff at Opus 12. In addition, she is a founding member of the Bay Area-based queer, trans, Asian Pacific Islander environmental justice group called the Environmental Justice League. So is very well steeped in environmental justice and activism in this space. So with that, I will cede the floor to Heidi.
Awesome. Very grateful to be in community with all of you today. I know this is going to feel a little bit different from normal AirMiners events. Like, I've been doing AirMiners events for a couple of years. This is the first time I think we've done an event around environmental justice or climate justice or something that's a little bit less about CDR specifically. So with that, I think we want to make this a space where we know that there are some it's going to be different, and how to prepare for that. So if we could go to the next slide, great. It'd be really great. The first thing we want to do is if you could put your pronouns next to your name on Zoom. I have it here. My name, Heidi Lim, and then parentheses, I use she and her as my pronouns. So the way you do that, I think a lot of you are probably Zoom vets by now, but go to the little window where your face is right now, or your name, and then there's little 3 dots. There's and then a drop down, and it says rename, and then you can type it in, hit enter. And that just really helps us to get just in the understanding that, you know, our perspective on our own gender, as well as other aspects of who we are, how we identify, may not be the same for everyone else. It would be good to not just assume certain things about people, including their gender. So I actually think this is something we should be doing in AirMiners moving forward. So very good to practice that. Second thing is, I'm asking everyone to stay engaged and commit to being here. we're an hour and a half together today. And the reason why we wanted to make space for all that time is so that we can have a real discussion. We can absorb a lot of information. We can be here with each other and really reflect on, what do we hear? What are we learning? And then share that with each other at the end in the breakout sessions. So please close other tabs and windows. If you can, set aside your devices and commit to being with us. I know it's a lot easier to do when we're in person, so we're going to try to do this as much as possible in a virtual environment. And then third, and this is really important, please be open to recognizing your privilege. There are going to be some new topics that we're going to cover that will probably require you to think about your own identity, to think about the ways in which you've moved around the world that other people don't have the privilege of doing. And that is uncomfortable. It can be, but it's also an opportunity for growth. So please be mindful that, you might feel some discomfort about some of the things that we talk about. We're going to name some truths and realities that, may feel like you're being kind of called out in some way. Jason and Tito are really good about naming, they are cis white hetero men. And I think a lot of people in the AirMiners tend to also be in this category. So it's not a personal attack, but it is just broadly thinking about how privilege does impact the way we are, the way we move with each other. Cool. I think that should be it. And with that, I will introduce our wonderful roundtable. We're going to get rid of the slides so we can have more of an open forum here. Thank you everyone again for joining us. So today we have three folks who are right in this intersection of environmental justice and carbon removal. Hopefully more of us could feel like we are right in the middle as well. We have Holly Buck, who's an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at SUNY Buffalo, where she teaches environmental justice. We have Femi Taiwo, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. His theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. He also engages in public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism. And Ugbad is a senior policy, Ugbad Kosar, is a senior policy advisor at Carbon 180. I think a lot of you know about Carbon 180. We also have Vanessa from Carbon 180 who will be part of our breakout crew. And Ugbad supports the organization's federal policy work on natural carbon removal solutions and leads their environmental justice work. I did not know that Carbon 180 did environmental justice work until I met Ugbad. So really cool to hear, and maybe we can hear a little bit more about what you're doing there. All right, first things first, I want to make sure everyone knows where we just has a kind of a grounding in what we're talking about when we talk about environmental justice. Could you guys talk a little bit more about what environmental justice means to you?
Well, I just want to hear what Femi and Ugbad say, but I guess for me, environmental justice is both a field of research and a movement and a principle. So it's a lot of things in one term, right? And it has multiple dimensions. So you can talk about distributive environmental justice, which has to do with how resources are divided up and shared and who bears risks from and harms from new technologies and projects and who reaps the benefits from them. You can talk about procedural environmental justice, so who gets to make decisions, who's at the table in the design of things. You can talk about recognitive or reparative environmental justice, and I hope we will in the next 30 minutes, but I would love to hear what everybody else on this awesome panel, how they define it.
Thanks, Holly. I think for me and a lot of other groups that are working in that space, it's really just a call for a health and safety, healthy and safe planet where people can live, they can work, they can learn, they can worship, and they can play safely. And I think the words environment and environmental justice are really intentional, because historically and conventionally, when you think about environmentalism, there's this image of wilderness and nature and, you know, very much a white-led space. And I think when you really think about environment in that word, it's actually also where people are and where we work and where we live. And I think for me in particular, it's I have a unique relationship with it, being a Black woman who comes from, you know, a low income community, who has lived in certain communities where we don't necessarily have access to green space, or we don't necessarily have access to safe housing. And so in addition to my work in climate and understanding how that environment and that aspect is integrated in environmental justice, I also think about my upbringing versus others' upbringing and how I can make sure that everybody has a similar safe space to grow up in as well.
Yeah, I mean, both of those are great answers, and I don't have too much to add. I guess I would just say what I think of is in distributive terms, which I think are also reparative terms, or, you know, they could be, and to use kind of the way that Holly put it. But at the end of the day, the question is both what Ugbad said in terms of what are the circumstances, what's the world like in which we work and we live and we play, but how does what it's like for me relate to what it's like for you? Is there pollution here because people elsewhere decided to ship that pollution here or decided to produce here in an irresponsible way? You know, those sorts of questions. So that's kind of how I start to think about it.
Thank you. That's a lot. I think so. So we're all coming from mostly, you know, a lot of people who are focused on developing technologies and interested in policies and trying to be helpful on the CDR side. What should we be considering when we're thinking about integrating environmental justice into carbon removal work?
I think that can build on with a lot of what Holly and Femi mentioned and how they're approaching and how they're defining environmental justice. So first off, it's not just what should be considered, but also when, and that's very much early on, right at the outset. So when you're researching or developing your technologies or your pathways or your strategies, really integrating EJ to understand what technologies you're actually pursuing and why. And so not just exploring what's feasible, what are the techno-economic assessments and that sort of stuff, but also figuring out ways to employ equity and public health frameworks and social justice frameworks. And that can seem like a lot of just different words. But when you really sit and think about questions that you can ask yourself, it's things like, are there historical contexts to draw from, or are there historical examples that you can learn from? Have potentially affected communities been included in the initial process of actually defining what the problem is and identifying what are those potential solutions? Do they fully understand the nature of the risks and the benefits? Where will these benefits be felt most acutely? And if the technology that you're putting forward or the pathway you're pursuing, if it does result in some sort of benefit, like a resource benefit, does that resource benefit certain communities versus others, and really thinking about that as well. There's, you know, can access to those benefits by underserved communities be improved through a decision-making process or through like a participatory process? These are a lot of questions, but not a lot of answers, but more so just thinking about as you're working through this. Are there any risks or impacts that are likely to be borne by communities that are already overburdened? And really thinking about what are those concerns or what are those risks? And then finally, you know, carbon removal is a really big space, and there's a lot of different technologies and pathways. And so really also honing down on a project by project basis and just really understanding your particular project. How would that impact that local community? how do they benefit and what are the drawbacks? And then thinking about responsibility, like if there's a failure, who's responsible for that and what happens? So more questions, not necessarily answers.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and would just plus one to two of the points that God made towards the end. So like for me, I have a kind of distributive mentality. So I'm thinking, not just what are the benefits and costs or drawbacks of carbon removal in some kind of abstract way, but what are they actually and who gets which, right? And one is the idea of putting the benefits, whether they're, jobs or access to professional advancement or the kind of ecological effects. Can we justify distributing the benefits and burdens in the way that is likely to happen if we do it this way rather than that way? And whose decision is that? Who gets to assess, who's part of evaluating whether or not that those benefits and burdens and the distribution of them is fair? I think those are key questions. And it just wraps around to, what started with, which is like, this is why it has to happen at the beginning, because once you're already down a path, it's harder to change course.
I might just add to those great points. I guess I have three thoughts. One is that because I think in part of the history of the EJ movement in the United States, how one narrative of how it was started was around activism around toxic waste and facilities siting, right? And so that's been an emphasis. And so people might reflexively think about environmental justice in terms of citing particular facilities with relation to carbon removal, but it's not just about that. I mean, maybe you don't have a big CCUS facility you're building, maybe you're designing a platform. Well, there's this whole emergent thought about design justice and kind of justice in tech broadly, right, that fits in there. So if you have a platform, who does that platform see and not see? Who can access it? Who can benefit? Like maybe you have this really cool thing for soil carbon, but the people that are going to reap the benefits are not farm workers, they're big landowners. So like, how do we think about that, right? I don't know. But then another point, I think that in terms of where the benefits flow to, I'm wondering, what other models within climate policy do we have? Is California's cap and trade greenhouse gas reduction fund, SB 535, et cetera, where funds go to disadvantaged and low income communities? Is there a way that can be a model for CDR? And I guess the third thing I'm thinking about a lot lately is the recognitive dimensions of environmental justice. And by that, I mean that there's not just one conception of justice or one experience of injustice, but these are all informed by particular histories and contexts. And I'm thinking a lot about indigenous environmental justice because I'm reading and teaching this book by Dina Gilio-Whitaker, As Long as Grass Grows, which is all about kind of the indigenous experience of genocide, really. And so if we're thinking about carbon removal on public lands and how to scale that up, but there's also an indigenous environmental justice movement thinking about land return of public lands, like where do those conflict and where might they work together? So a lot of big questions there.
We could definitely be here for a few days. I think one day we might need to do like a retreat together. There's so much to think about there, and I think one of the things we want to do, one of the goals of this event we would like to meet is just to think about how do we take the environmental justice learning and put it into our own work, and continue to build on that ourselves as an AirMiners community. Could you guys talk, like, you have a lot of questions, there's a lot of topics there, little pieces there in EJ. Could you provide any context on like how do organizations and companies put all of those all of this into action? Are there tools that are available to help think through these questions, or yeah, how would we go about doing that? Or is that something that we build ourselves together, maybe?
I mean, I've been thinking about a framework in terms of like, here are the things that you'd want to think about, but I haven't elaborated that more beyond like 5 points because I think it's really a collective effort and I'm not the best person to, you know, it would really should come from people who are working in movements and communities.
Yeah, +1 on that, Holly. We're trying to figure that out, and a lot of it is just having conversations with different groups and figuring out what's important to them and what they do and how they operate. So it's not necessarily something that one as an organization can put forward and say, this is the checklist that you need to do, but trying to figure out ways to actually open up conversations and figure out what actually works with your organization or your company. And a lot of that is going to have to come from whether it's in the workforce, like labor unions, having conversations with them about what's important to them, or if it's specific environmental justice pieces, talking with EJ experts and understanding where they're coming from and what their priorities are. You know, it's very abstract, but.
Yeah, just +1, but I think you know, events exactly like this are part of that. And, you know, more conversations of the kind that folks were just mentioning. I think that's how it happens, if it happens.
Heidi, can I just add one more thing really quickly on that?
Yeah, of course.
One point in particular, especially if you are going to be working with EJ experts or those that are in the environmental justice movement, typically they're really under-resourced. And so if you are reaching out for that type of expertise, finding ways to flow money to their organizations and supporting what they're doing is a really concrete way of addressing it, because sometimes there's work that they want to do, but there's prioritization that happens because there's just no access to funding. And so that's another way, if you want more engagement in carbon removal, is finding ways to fund the work that they're doing and expand their capacity as well.
I have a follow-up question for you, Agbad. You said we are working on this kind of a framework. Are you talking about like what the work you're doing at Carbon 180?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I think we're not the only ones, for sure. There's quite a few different groups that are thinking about this, but that is exactly what we're trying to do. Is if we're going to be creating policies and if we're going to be supporting deployment strategies, or if we're going to be working with policymakers and folks that are on the Hill, we're not experts on environmental justice, truthfully. And so we're trying to recognize that and have these conversations so that we can have that expertise work with us. And so we're bringing in that carbon removal expertise through science and through business and through policy, and then having EJ and labor unions and other green groups also bring in their backgrounds. And I think that's the only really way to create these frameworks. It's very much a collective effort, and that's just, we're early stages, but that's exactly what we're trying to do.
That's awesome. So some folks, we had attendees write some of their questions in when they registered, and one of the things I heard was asking, how do we best engage people who are part of the communities that will be potentially impacted and stakeholders? How do we bring them to the table? Is that something we would do through an organization that has more experience in the area, or is it something we should be doing directly?
I'll venture something, even though I'm not sure it's the best answer. I think that, you know, there's a large body of work on co-producing knowledge and sustainability, which is, I think, relevant here. So there's best practices for community engagement in research that I think some of them transfer to community engagement in project design and outreach. And I mean, some of it is pretty intuitive stuff. So listen, be prepared to change course, figure out what that community needs and is interested in, and see if carbon removal fits into it. And it might not, it might be some other thing, right? Pretty basic answer, but.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to finding the kind of best practices for project design. One of the things I imagine is involved in those best practices is a kind of science communication, and not even just science communication, but just communication, right? I mean, I don't think carbon removal is, even in the broadest strokes, all that mainstream, much less that, you know, the average person is in a position to have a granular conversation about, you know, the benefits and burdens of ocean alkalinization or whatever it is, right? So I just, I think one of the things that has to be part and parcel of this is being able to communicate effectively to people who aren't worried about any company's bottom line and who aren't worried about like any particular like set of politics, but who are just like, for my community, what does this mean? And it's less straightforward, you know, saying it out loud, saying it directly sounds obvious, but I think, you know, once you actually start to put pen to paper and figure out how you would say, you know, what is it that my particular carbon removal project would do in this area? What would the risks be? What would the benefits be? Why should people be interested in it? You know, I think there's quite a bit of work to be done there. And once that step gets done, it'll be easier to get people to the table to talk about it, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to jump on what Femi said and try to improve my answer with something concrete. I think that what Femi just described involves evolving a common language. And so I was doing a project where I was knocking on doors in the middle of the US along a prospective CO2 pipeline route and just trying to start a conversation with whoever answered at specific points about carbon removal. And, you know, most people hadn't heard of or thought of carbon removal, but they all had some type of environmental sustainability issue that they were concerned about, even if they weren't going to frame it in those terms. Once you sat down and started talking to them, they might have been concerned about the well on their land running out of water or having access to hunting land or whatever it might be, you know, and until you go through those steps of figuring out how they approach it, it's going to be really hard to have that common conversation common language where people want to engage on this topic.
Yeah, I think climate change in general, I often say is a communications issue. Like that same thing is with CDR. And even this is a good transition. I think like Femi and Holly, you wrote this article, I think it was part of our pre-rating, Capturing Carbon to Fight Climate Change is Dividing Environmentalists. Like even within the environmentalist space, I think we're not always seeing eye to eye or communicating with each other. I certainly know on the EJ side, there's a stigma of like carbon capture, utilization, storage, and some skepticism about the ways that we can approach CDR. Can you talk a little bit more about the kind of gap between like strictly environmental justice communities and what carbon removal communities are doing? And maybe some ideas about how we can kind of bridge that gap.
I mean, I can just quickly share that when I was having conversations and venturing into opening up the conversation about carbon removal, they're similar to what Holly said about the common language. Not everyone fully understood or was aware of what exactly carbon removal was. And a lot of the time, most of the time actually was just spent going through different technologies or their thoughts or their perspective on what carbon removal was and just talking through that. And I wouldn't say that necessarily swayed the conversation or all of a sudden everybody was for it, but it brought a lot of clarity to the conversation and helped us move forward to the next step. So in particular, the first thing that came up often, and I don't want to say everybody, there is definitely a lot of environmental organizations and others that are very aware of carbon removal and are deeply, very much aware of what it is. But for those groups that weren't, it was directly tied to point source carbon capture storage. And that was the immediate reaction. And then all of the failures and shortcomings of, you know, coal CCS and talking about those projects, like that is where the conversation immediately went to. And so the major gap sometimes is just understanding what carbon removal actually encompasses and how they are similar and different and how they interact with other forms of like carbon capture storage, for example. So that's something that I think everybody could probably figure out how to better communicate that piece in particular.
I think that's right. And I feel like my conversations with people about carbon removal have often gone that same way. So that also resonates with me. But I think alongside that point about just the kind of factual understanding of carbon removal, I think there's also a more like politically relational thing happening, which is like, you know, I mean, like all of us, I think this is a thing that makes sense to do. This is a way that makes sense to think. You know, I do this myself. When I don't know a lot about something, what I'll default to is what I know about the kind of person who advocates for it, right? And I think, you know, my sense has been that, especially in the kind of global South politics space, that there's a huge trust gap where like people are like, I don't know exactly what carbon removal is, but I know that the only people I see pushing for it are like, you know, fossil fuel barons, and I imagine them petting a cat in a swivel chair and laughing maniacally like they're fucking supervillains, and therefore carbon removal must be this evil thing, right? And people, you know, before you can get granular with people, you have to, I think, get people to trust you enough to look into it past that kind of initial impression. And more, I think more to the point, there has to be another narrative besides the fossil fuel enhanced oil recovery thing in circulation, you know, to kind of open up space for these conversations that are taking a wider range of ways that carbon removal could be a part of climate policy seriously. And so that's been a thing I've been thinking about recently.
Awesome. Let's talk about climate policy then. Yeah, you all mentioned policy a few times. Like, what is the role of policymaking in the space?
I mean, you could talk about this on multiple scales, and I guess I'm looking to Ubed as kind of the super expert here, but I wanted to add to what Femi just said. One thing I noticed when there was a recent hearing about CCUS, Representative Nanette Berrigan from Southern California asked a question of the witnesses about EOR in old oil wells and was it going to increase pollution. So I think the enhanced oil recovery thing is a big thing that this community should take on in an aggressive and explicit way. But related to that, I think there's an opportunity in remediating old wells and cleaning up, you know, these landscapes of fossil fuel destruction, especially since you can inject into old wells. So like maybe policy has a role in figuring that out and merging those projects in a way that's beneficial. One out of many things.
I have a kind of a question to inject there. Is transparency part of like the solution here, or and is that something that maybe is related to policy?
Yeah, definitely. But it's just one step, you know.
I mean, the big thing for me, and I also, you know, desperately want to hear what Ubed has to say about this, but the one thing I will say is just, to me, it's about getting the distributions right. So the bond challenge for, I guess, restoring / replanting a bunch of the world's deforested and degraded land. 75% of the land pledged to that is on the African continent, right? And it's not that that's a project entirely motivated by carbon removal, but that's just to say, like, that's a perverse distribution of responsibility, globally speaking. And I think that's the kind of thing we have to be out in front of. Like, what would be key to putting carbon removal into a justice serving place in climate policy is at the different scales, like Holly said, globally, nationally, regionally, locally. We're making sure that we're distributing the benefits and burdens of carbon removal in a way that makes sense. And, you know, I don't think we can get there except by trying on purpose to do that fairly and to figure out what fair would even mean and to enforce that and to govern accordingly. But that's kind of my framework.
Yeah, I mean, +1 to everything Holly and Femi said. And I don't know if it's because I work in policy, or maybe I'm biased, I don't know, but I think policy making has a huge role. It can either continue to really perpetuate this environmental racism and all of these concepts that we were talking about and really uphold business as usual, or we can use it to actually codify some of these goals that we've been talking about and institutionalize the principles of EJ to underpin climate policy. And a couple like really specific examples, we work on things like appropriations, which is how programs get funding. And so it really shapes research and development agendas. It really research how programs are implemented. And so getting involved and plugged into that space has a major role in what the outcomes are going to be for carbon removal. There is, I mean, there's just so many, I don't know how to, I'm getting overwhelmed. I think policy can help really regulate how actors are going to be working in the space. And so similar to what Femi said, like through policy, you can help ensure fair distribution of resources and then freedoms. If you're speaking in an international space, I mean, land tenureship is a huge issue. And so policy is also a way to address that. So, I mean, different levels, but addressing market and investment uncertainties, all of it. I mean, policy is everywhere, whether you're looking at the local level, the national or the international, and it's pervasive, it's everywhere. So without actually finding ways to integrate it in every step, it's gonna be business as usual.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're at the end. We're nearing the end of the roundtable section, and I want to give people time to put questions in the chat box. So please do that, and Tito and Jason will look at it. But my last roundtable question for you is, what can AirMiners do moving forward? And I mean, particularly in policy, like what could we do to help with that better policy making? You know, how do we keep engaged in this work?
I mean, my immediate reaction is doing anti-oppression work within your organization to start off with, and really actually working to understand why we're even talking about this. Sometimes it can be so abstract, or you know it's a good idea, but you don't really know why. And the comment you made about addressing your privileges, I mean, that is a really good place to start across all organizations. So that's what I would do.
I agree with that. I guess what I had to add is just, you know, I only have a hammer, so all I see is nails. But distributions. I think but in particular, like a concrete thing to say is, I think if AirMiners came up with, you know, maybe some case studies, or maybe a more general kind of global and or national picture of like, here's a plan of rolling out carbon removal or this particular carbon removal here, that is a fair distribution, and here's why we think it's fair. I don't think the point of this wouldn't be getting it right. Like, obviously people are going to disagree, people are going to have some things to say, but the point is, can we have that conversation explicitly, right? As opposed to leaving it all implicit in just the decision to build something over here rather than there. I think the more that we can collaboratively relate to that question and explicitly, I think the more likely we are to pull people in to see what it has to do with them in the first place, and also, you know, feel like they're, and actually be empowered to participate in the politics of doing carbon removal and having policy around the development of carbon removal and the research for it and so on and so forth.
I guess I'll point out two brief things. One is that if you're working on a project and you know that you might not be able to see everything that is important, consider forming a very level of formalities advisory group that can, and pay those people well for their time, because they're probably super overburdened. That's what I would do personally if I was starting a venture. Because I know that even, you know, I can't see a lot of the things that are important. The other thing on a broader level in terms of carbon removal is going to need policy to happen, right? I think everybody agrees on that. So pick something and advocate for it. Maybe it's a carbon take back requirement. That's one of my personal favorites, but you know, it might not be for you. But I mean, get in there to the extent that you can and advocate for whatever it is.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's great. I know at like Opus 12, we are fairly active in talking to policymakers, and you know, as for everyone here who is doing kind of the technology work or other work that doesn't seem policy oriented, like there's still ways to do that, and they certainly need more of us to talk to them. So no, that resonates. That was awesome. Thank you all for your very thoughtful answers. Yeah. Now we're going to go into Q&A. We'll make this, we have 10 minutes, but I think we have a bunch of questions, so we might make it a little bit longer maybe. But so here's a question from Mark, who has an idea that may help to get past the fossil supervillain reaction. This is the idea. What do you think about it? Start talking about about now into the future that fossil fuel users need to pay for the removal of the fossil CO2 that has been emitted since 1950. Thumbs up from Holly and Femi.
Yeah, I think I managed to, I think I typed something in the chat about this, but just I believe in the general version of that. I also believe in the kind of geopolitical version of that, which is first world, global north, whatever you want to call it, developed countries, in particular, putting the investment dollars towards this in response to the fact that, cumulatively speaking, they have disproportionately contributed to emissions. So framing it in terms, framing carbon removal in terms of responsibility for past emissions rather than a blank check for future emissions is usually seems to work with the people that I talk to, but you know, your mileage may vary.
Okay, here's another question from Grant. Is a reasonable level of climate justice possible under global slash extractive capitalism?
No. Sorry. Longer answer. I think climate crisis as a crisis is just the most powerful demonstration of the incompatibility of capitalism with continued human life on this planet. But that's a, you know, That's a long-term thing. If we're talking about human history on the scale of centuries, then I think we're talking about figuring some other way of living on the planet out. But I don't think on the scale of, the next decade, that's necessarily the practical goal that makes sense, replacing that social system. I think we might have to do some other stuff in the meantime. And capitalism, racial capitalism, is kind of a sunk cost in the medium term, but I don't know.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more. Thank you for that answer, Femi. A couple more. One from Greg. Given that one, increasing atmospheric CO2 is causing environmental and social injustice via climate change, and two, emissions reduction alone has failed to adequately address this problem, isn't CDR now required to help achieve environmental and social justice? Can we have justice without CDR?
I mean, I think it's required. That's what I argued in my book anyway. I think that, CDR doesn't necessarily mean there will be justice, because it can come in so many forms. So you could definitely have a world that removes a whole bunch of carbon, but is very unequal. And it's our job to stop that from happening.
Yeah, plus one on what Holly said. I think if you're just thinking about tons removed, then of course, carbon removal can address that climate change, but it's really important about understanding how you're actually removing that carbon in the process. But I do think it's also very necessary.
Yeah, I have yet to see the version of making it through climate crisis that wouldn't involve carbon removal on a gigaton scale. And when someone can show me that, then we can, have the discussion about whether or not to do carbon removal. But I haven't seen it.
Okay, last question. This one's from Matthew. As Americans, should we prioritize environmental justice in our own backyard rather than elsewhere in the world? And thank you for mentioning the geopolitics.
I think the problem so we live in this globalized system where things are connected by atmospheres and supply chains and flows of elements and what on. So, I think it would be hard to just focus in on one scale. Sometimes there's things that you need to do on a local scale, but you're going to need international action to provoke investments on the national scale that will flow to the local. So these scales are all really interconnected.
Yeah, and even if you have environmental justice movements that are really focused on localized issues, they are also very interconnected, because even though they're focused on their own local issues, they're also working together collectively to figure out how they can all mobilize and get their priorities done. So it's a similar thing. Like, it's really hard to just focus on yourself when everything is so connected.
Right. And I think those points are true in general for any country that you pick. But I think we also have to recognize that the United States is an empire. It has a military of world conquest proportions. It has military bases in much of the world. It has a strong influence, let's say, on regional politics, multinational institutions, so on and so forth. And so there's, all that stuff may be opaque to us as individual Americans, but it's nevertheless true of the place that we live. And so it's nevertheless part of our responsibilities to address, whether or not we feel those connections.
All right. So let's give a round of applause again for everyone, and unmute yourself if you can. Thank you to our wonderful roundtable folks. I would love to, continue this conversation, and also thank you for doing all this work. We're just kind of starting off on this, and I think it's so great. Y'all are pioneers I don't know, that's just kind of originators in the space, in the intersection. So we really appreciate you being here. Now we're gonna do our breakouts, which one of the things, we want to do is give ourselves an opportunity to talk to each other and reflect for ourselves and with each other, and think about a few questions that we've kind of prepared. Our panelists have graciously offered to stay, and so if you're lucky, I think about half of the breakout rooms will have one of the panelists. So luck of the draw a little bit, but they'll be sticking around a little bit. Actually, let's go back to the ground rules, Tito, just to keep in mind. Setting again, just kind of grounding us in like what we want to have as kind of our ground rules here. Take space and make space. So we want you to, of course, everyone, there's going to be a lot of thoughts. We're going to have really active conversations. Just be aware of the space that you're taking. And, if somebody's not talking that much, make space for them to talk, because everyone's coming from a different place. But it's everyone's job to kind of make sure that everyone is given the space that they need. And then assume good intent, name impact, own impact. Thank you. This is from Aruna Wang, who brought this over from, I think, her university days. This is something I really like, which is just, somebody says something and it feels uncomfortable, feel free to name it. And if you made somebody feel uncomfortable, understand that is valid, the person, if they felt that way, and, don't take too much offense to it, and assume good intent as well, if you can, of where people are coming from. I think, some people may make a small stumble, but if we all agree to this, then I think we'll be able to communicate really well. Again, stay engaged, close all your windows and other tabs. Feel free to speak your truths. We're all coming from our personal experience, so please share that with everyone else. And again, be open to recognizing your privilege. Tito and Jason, are we taking 5 minutes in between a little break first, or do we have time?
Hey, why don't I put people into breakouts now, and we can, give maybe a minute or two in the breakouts before we get started. If people want to drop, if you'll have to drop now because they have a meeting at the top of the hour or something, then now's a good time.
Great. Okay, cool. So it sounds like we're all going to get into our breakouts, but we'll save a minute or two for us to have, if you need a bio break, or if you want to just have a moment of silence to reflect and process. That was a lot of information that we got through just now. So breakout questions, what were your takeaways from the discussion? And how did it all resonate with you? Do you have any thoughts about how do you take what we learned and put it into your own work? How do you put it into action? And it'd be great also to think about what are some ways the AirMiners community can play a role in environmental justice. We talked, the roundtable, everyone gave some really concrete thoughts on how to be actionable. And there's some areas that I think we can actually go and do pretty quickly. So if you have somebody in the group who can kind of take notes, or if each of you take notes, we will leave 10 minutes at the end before the end of, so that's at 1:20 Pacific time, where we would love to have a few people just share about what came out of it. And just noting that we're also planning to have, maybe in a month or so, it's not scheduled yet, but we're planning to have a second event where it's more about just internal discussions, where we can all come together and do more of the workshopping a little bit more together. But I think it'd be good to have a teaser since we're fresh on what we come up with in the breakout rooms. Cool. Is that it, Jason? Are you ready?
Yeah, that's it. We'll have, looks like 8 breakout rooms with 5 or 6 people per breakout room. And I'll send you there now.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. So yeah, we have 9 minutes if we want to be on time.
Yep.
What were your takeaways? What came out of your breakout sessions? Let's do Louise and then Matthew.
Is that me, Louise Handy? I can't see mine.
Yeah.
Thanks. Something that came up in our group was the initial discussion that maybe has to happen with communities affected by carbon removal activity, and getting over the initial, why it has to be done. And we talked a little bit about public's perception on nature-based versus like artificial solutions or highly technological solutions. So that was something that that came up. And when it comes to engaging others in this area, we have to educate and inform in the offset.
Totally. All right, Matthew, are you still here?
Yep, I'm here.
Go for it.
Cool. So wow, so many good points. I have a whole page of notes. I'll just say one which came up at the very beginning of the discussion, kind of talking more about like the environmental justice as experienced by people who are living next to industrial facilities. And Lori said, first she said something that was kind of serious and then said something sort of joking, but I wrote down the joke because I actually think it's pretty legit. So I'll say both of the things. She said, just like any form of energy, be careful. And then she kind of yelled, what chemicals are you using? But like, seriously, what chemicals are you using? So I think like lots of takeaways, but I think that's a really good, concise one.
Great. I don't see any other new hands up. So feel free to unmute.
I am just unmuting. Hi, everyone. Great to see your faces. So I think we started the conversation being struck by, one, the key role racial justice plays in environmental justice and in what we do in our carbon removal work. And I think it bears to be repeated how working within our organizations on anti-oppression is so critical in moving forward in an equitable way. And two, there's this reimagining of capitalism that we need to put some time and thought and mind and heart into. Because I think this is all, the panel was amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, everyone. But I think it's important to recognize that, we could indeed be removing gigatons of carbon and still support a highly oppressive social structure. So those are, I think, some highlights from our discussion that I felt it in my heart as a person of color, as a minority group. So thanks for bringing that to light, and thanks for bringing that discussion into this community.
Yeah, this is, I think, something that's really interesting. We had a kind of pre-panel discussion with the panelists and had a small conversation about like, how do you reconcile capitalism and the work that we all do as AirMiners, where a lot of us are technologists and building companies. Like, does anyone have thoughts to share about that? Maybe particularly the folks on the round table.
I'll jump in with our group because it relates here. Marcos posted Fratelli Tutti, which is the Pope's latest encyclical. And that talks about capitalism and it would make you feel uncomfortable. And how do you do this? But yeah, if you're thinking seriously about all this stuff, you ought to read the whole 78 pages. And then you wonder, okay, but how do we do this? And the other thing we had as a suggestion in our group is if you have a marine-based CDR technology, you ought to write it up as a potential program or project in the ocean decade, which I think I linked up here somewhere. Maybe I should just put the link in for the ocean decade. Local coastal communities will then see that potential project and program. And if anyone will want to do that, that'll be a good indication that it's probably has some environmental justice going for it.
So,
and I didn't take notes, so anybody else wants to chime in.
So picking up about the Pope, the Cliff Note version of that encyclical, which is very long, is the 11-minute speech that he gave at the Countdown on Sunday. Look for TED Countdown. It was phenomenal. It was the most hard-hitting thing I've heard from almost anybody. And I think, the last question that was posed, I think AirMiners has this real potential to encourage people to set their goals higher. And we're doing that, saying we don't have to just settle for the worst consequences of, reducing the worst consequences. We can actually regenerate, repair, restore the world and open people's eyes to that. And I think the same way we can answer this question when people say, solving climate change, isn't that enough? You're also talking about healthcare or housing, all these sorts of things, the kinds of accusations people give. And I posted in the chat, I'm not sure if it went to everybody, Hod Hopkins from the Sierra Club. He basically said, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism. And I think we can just sort of say what we're trying to do, in reversing climate change is we're actually saying we don't have to just sort of make inequality a little bit less bad in the world, but we can allow ourselves to work for what we really hope for, what we really want. And I think we can take the lead in that.
Great, excellent thoughts. We are 1 minute left. So Heidi, any other final comments, or Tito, any other final comments before we close?
Look out for further discussion, because we got to continue this, and there's obviously a lot to talk about. So, but we'll be scheduling something. I think maybe in a month or so.
Yeah.
After the election and everything happens. So yeah, next month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and building on that and on Felix's previous comment, yes, this is the start. This is far from the final word. So be on the lookout for future activities from AirMiners in this on this topic. And final note, our next event will be in 2 weeks. Tito will be hosting a session at Verge. Also at Verge, Ugbad Kosar will be on a panel about environmental justice. So please, if you want to pursue this topic further, look to AirMiners, but also look to events at Verge, and we will see you all soon. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Heidi for an excellent job of moderating. Thank you to Tito, and we will see you all again soon. And feel free to join AirMiners if you haven't already.
Thank you, everyone.